Friends, this is the story of a donkey who witnessed a heinous act, a young girl's dignity being violated. But this was no ordinary donkey. You can't imagine the courage it mustered as it journeyed to the king's court and revealed a secret so shocking that it shook the entire kingdom. This heart-wrenching tale will send shivers down your spine and stir your soul. If you're visiting this channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe. The winter season was at its peak, with foggy and freezing nights. Yet, the king stood silently on the palace rooftop, gazing at the moon, lost in deep thought. Whenever the king was troubled, 3 distinct lines would appear on his forehead. And today, he seemed particularly uneasy. For 3 days, this had been his state, and it was beginning to weigh heavily on him. Despite strict orders to his guards, the situation remained unchanged. As he stood there for a few moments, he suddenly felt someone's presence behind him. Instinctively, he gripped his sword and turned, but immediately stopped when he saw his beautiful queen, standing with her hands clasped in front of her, smiling. Her radiant face glowed in the dark night. The king smiled faintly, sheathed his sword, and took his queen in his arms. He kissed her cheek lovingly and asked, "My love, what are you doing here? It's so cold, and you don't seem to care about yourself." Although the queen was wrapped in warm clothes, the king still worried about her well-being. Smiling, she looked at the king and said, "When my husband is so restless, feeling neither the cold nor the heat, how can I sit comfortably by the fire downstairs? Tell me, what is troubling you so deeply? You are the peace of my heart. But when you are disturbed, my world is thrown into turmoil too." Hearing these affectionate words brought a smile to the king's face, and he sat down with her on the throne nearby. His eyes were lowered, and though the cold began to seep into him as well, his concerns had overshadowed everything else. He looked at his wife and said, "I don't know why, but it feels as though our Lord is displeased with me." The queen's expression immediately turned serious. "Why do you feel that way? Is everything all right, Your Majesty? Did you have a dream?" she asked, with genuine concern. The king shook his head and replied, "It wasn't a dream, but rather a strange feeling. I can't say for sure if it's just a thought or a reality." His vague words left the queen puzzled. She couldn't make sense of his concerns and asked, "Your Majesty, what are you trying to say? Your words are confusing, and I'm only getting more worried. Please, tell me in detail what's going on." The king glanced at her face, then looked away and stood up. At that moment, he didn't feel it was appropriate to share his thoughts with her. His face grew serious as he wrestled with the thought that perhaps his lord was truly displeased with him, a feeling that had been haunting him continuously. Gently, he took his queen into his arms and began leading her downstairs from the rooftop. The cold was biting, and while he could endure it, his queen was delicate and prone to illness. He couldn't bear the thought of her falling sick or being distressed. He escorted her to their chamber and then headed toward his private study. The queen attempted to follow him, but a single glance from the king made her stop in her tracks. Quietly, she stayed behind. In his private study, the king was surrounded by silence. This room held many secrets, secrets known only to the king. He sat quietly on his throne, his fist clenched, his gaze fixed on an invisible point. He seemed consumed by thoughts, as though trapped in a problem for which he could find no solution. Moments later, a knock at the door broke the silence. Surprised, he hesitated for a moment. No one was supposed to know he was in this particular room. In a deep voice, he granted permission for the visitor to enter. However, he discreetly unsheathed his sword and held it in his left hand out of sight, ready to defend himself if necessary. The door opened to reveal his trusted minister. The king's serious demeanor softened, and he laughed at his own precaution. The minister, who had been waiting for permission to speak, was taken aback by the king's unexpected smile and laughter. It was a rare sight, as the king seldom smiled, let alone laughed. Quickly masking his surprise, the minister bowed and said, "Your Majesty, if I may speak freely?" The king nodded slightly, signaling him to continue, his eyes questioning. The minister began, Your Majesty, while you were on the rooftop, a man came requesting an audience with you. He claims to be plagued by immense regret and wishes to share his troubles with you, hoping for relief. He has lost his sleep at night, his peace during the day, and he feels utterly restless. He has earnestly pleaded for a chance to meet you so that his problem might find a solution. The king responded instinctively, "If this man is still waiting outside, bring him in at once. We shall hear what he has to say." However, the minister shook his head and said, "No, Your Majesty, I sent him away. This is your private time, dedicated to reviewing important documents or spending moments with the Queen. I did not want anyone to interrupt your precious time," he said thoughtfully. The king gently shook his head in disapproval and looked at the minister, saying, "No, my dear minister, this is not how one rules a kingdom. A king must sacrifice himself for his people. If someone in my kingdom cannot sleep peacefully, if their days are restless, it is my duty to help them and bring them solace. For when I stand before Allah, I shall be asked how I could sleep peacefully while one of my subjects was distressed." The king could not sleep. The thought of the man who had come with his troubles but was turned away without being heard haunted him. The minister stood with his head bowed in shame. The king spoke again, "Do you know where this man lives?" The minister regretfully shook his head. The king's face grew more serious, and he said sternly, "In the future, if any petitioner comes to you with a plea, do not dare send them back empty-handed. I cannot tolerate someone seeking help only to be dismissed. Such behavior would displease my lord. For now, leave. If that man returns, bring him to me immediately. I wish to hear his problem." The minister respectfully bowed, saluted, and left. The king, however, found himself trapped in an unusual state of mind. He sat silently in his private chamber for a while. As the night deepened, he abandoned his work and walked towards the royal bedroom. As usual, his queen had fallen asleep waiting for him. She was still wearing her socks. The king smiled softly, sat near her feet, and gently began removing her socks. He was the ruler of a great kingdom before whom the world bowed. Yet here he was, sitting humbly at his wife's feet. To him, his queen was the crown of his life. His love for her was boundless, a love without limits. The king often said that she was the one who absorbed all his fears, who stood by him through every difficulty, and who silently accepted all his decisions. She was the woman who continued his lineage and sacrificed her world for his. He believed that if a man could understand this, his life would be successful and his afterlife would be paradise. He smiled, gazed at his queen's innocent face, and changed into more comfortable clothing before lying down beside her. He intended to wake up for the tahajjud prayer, but couldn't shake the thought that if the same problem arose again, it would trouble him deeply. He prayed from his heart for a peaceful night. The king had been restless for days, feeling that something was disrupting his devotion. This thought distressed him, as he detested anything interfering with his worship. He was deeply saddened by the possibility that his actions might have created a barrier between him and his Creator. Lost in these thoughts, he drifted into sleep. But as soon as the time for tahajjud arrived, he awoke. His habit of waking up at this hour had become second nature, and he often felt as though an unseen force guided him to rise for the prayer. After waking up, he stretched, took a deep breath, and headed to the washroom. There, he changed his clothes, performed ablution, and stepped outside to gaze at the sky while reciting the Kalima. He spread his prayer mat, prostrated himself before Allah, and offered his tahajjud prayer. Lifting his hands in prayer, he humbly pleaded, "O Lord of Mustafa, O Master of all worlds, I seek your protection and well-being. O Allah, guide me to what is best, and free me from this difficulty. If you are displeased with me, forgive me, for I cannot bear your wrath. I am a sinner. Every human errs, and so have I. Please forgive me." He earnestly sought forgiveness, convinced that his current state was a punishment for some mistake he had made. Unbeknownst to him, Allah was not displeased with him, but was preparing to send him a significant message. After tahajjud, his eyes fell upon the Quran. For a moment, the same thoughts crossed his mind. But shaking them off, the king held the Quran in his hands, kissed it, and pressed it against his chest before walking toward the balcony. 3 lamps were lit there as part of his daily routine. After tahajjud prayers, he would recite the Quran. His recitation had such a mesmerizing effect that birds would gather on the balcony to listen, a sight that deeply comforted the king. His queen would remain in deep sleep, never disturbed by his recitation, though his voice carried a unique serenity that captivated anyone who heard it. The king began his recitation with Bismillah and started reading Surah Yasin. He had barely completed the first verse when the braying of a donkey suddenly broke the tranquility. This had been happening for 3 days now. Every time he began his recitation, the donkey would start braying, and as soon as he stopped, the donkey would fall silent. The king's frustration was mounting, and he felt deeply unsettled by this daily disruption. It felt as though something divine was displeased, preventing him from continuing his recitation. Yet he couldn't understand why. If Allah were truly displeased with me, he thought, why would he still allow me to pray, to offer my daily prayers, and perform additional ones like Ishraq, Chasht, and Tahajjud? Why then was he being disrupted only during the recitation of the Quran? He closed the Quran for a moment, and the braying immediately ceased. As he resumed reciting, the donkey's voice returned as soon as he completed another verse. Growing increasingly troubled, the king stood up and walked to the balcony. The birds that had gathered to listen to him flew away instantly. The king scanned his surroundings, but there was no one around who could explain the disturbance. Returning to the room, he found his queen awake. She looked at him with questioning eyes and asked, "What's wrong, Your Majesty? Is everything all right? Why did you stop reciting?" The king looked at her, surprised. "You were awake? But you were in such deep sleep," he said. Smiling, she shook her head. "I was asleep, but when you stopped, I woke up." "Why did you go quiet?" The king took a deep breath, knowing that once again he wouldn't be able to complete his recitation. Silently, he apologized to Allah, wrapped the Quran in its cover, and set it aside before sitting down next to his queen. "What's wrong, Your Majesty?" she asked again. "You seem troubled, as though something heavy is weighing on your mind. Share it with me. Perhaps I can help. Keeping things bottled up won't solve anything. Only by discussing them can we find solutions." But the king remained silent. He had yet to find an answer to his dilemma and wasn't ready to share it with anyone. He pulled his queen close and extinguished the lamp, ensuring she wouldn't press him further. The next morning, when the king woke, he was still in bed, but his queen was no longer beside him. He knew exactly where she would be and remained lying there, reflecting on the events of the previous night. It was the 4th day now, yet the same issue persisted. Was Allah truly displeased with him? Or was there a hidden message he was meant to uncover? A thought suddenly struck him. Could someone else be in distress? Determined, the king resolved that no matter what, He would investigate the matter of the donkey today. Why did the donkey start braying every time he recited the Quran? This was no trivial matter to the king, as Quran recitation held immense importance in his life. His closeness to Allah made the disruptions feel like a dagger to his heart. After sitting on his bed, deep in thought for a while, he was interrupted by a soldier delivering a message. Quietly, the king rose and prepared to face the day. The breakfast table was already set, and the royal court was ready for him. Pushing his thoughts aside, he headed to the washroom. After bathing, he dressed in a regal royal robe, adorned his head with the royal turban, and stepped out. His destination was the breakfast table, where his queen and family awaited him. The king despised making others wait for him, fully aware that waiting was akin to suffering. As he entered, everyone stood to greet him in respect. The king gestured slightly for everyone to be seated and took his place. His queen immediately began serving his breakfast, but the king ate in silence. Usually he would smile during breakfast, engaging in light-hearted conversation with his family. But today he neither spoke to anyone nor looked in their direction. He ate very little before standing up abruptly. His queen stood with him, deeply concerned. The king had never behaved this way before, and there had to be a significant reason behind his unusual demeanor. The king bid farewell to everyone, kissed his wife lovingly on her forehead, and left for the royal court. The guard promptly announced the king's arrival, prompting the courtiers, ministers, royal guards, and advisors to stand in respect. The king entered the court with grandeur, greeted with a magnificent reception. Voices of salutations filled the air, to which the king responded with a slight nod before proceeding to his throne. As he approached his seat, his minister bowed deeply and greeted him. The king returned the greeting in a regal manner and took his place on the throne, immediately commanding the court session to begin. Today, he did not speak to any guards, soldiers, or courtiers, as he usually did upon entering the court. His unusual silence and distant demeanor were evident to all. The minister observed that the king's mind was preoccupied, and his behavior was far from ordinary. Petitioners began presenting their grievances before the king. But for the first time, the king struggled to address their issues, often making mistakes. This did not go unnoticed by the courtiers. The minister approached the king cautiously and asked softly, "Your Majesty, is everything all right? Are you feeling well?" The king rubbed his forehead and shook his head slightly. Rising from his throne, he declared to everyone present that he could not hold court today. He admitted to being caught in a minor predicament and assured them that he would return to the court once he resolved it. With that, he left, and the minister followed him closely, unwilling to leave the king alone during this troubled time. The king entered his private chamber, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't bring himself to share his inner turmoil with anyone. He performed ablution and stood for the Zuhr prayer. When the minister knocked on the door, hoping to enter, he saw the king praying and quietly walked away. After completing his prayer, the king raised his hands in supplication. Though his lips were silent, his tears flowed continuously. Feeling helpless, he prayed fervently, his heart heavy with sorrow. "O Lord of Mustafa, Creator of all worlds, you know how deeply I love you. I have forsaken the world to seek you. O Allah, I am in immense pain. Are you angry with me? I feel no peace, not even for a moment. Have you turned away from me? Why am I being deprived of the sweetness of reciting your Quran? Why is this happening to me? O Allah, if you are displeased with me, then please forgive me. Forgive my every shortcoming and ease my life. Have mercy on me and erase all my errors." The king pleaded with Allah for forgiveness for a long time, his heart holding on to the hope that his Lord would pardon him. After finishing his Zuhr prayer and his lengthy supplication, He wiped his tear-streaked face and took a deep breath. He resolved to uncover the mystery behind the donkey's braying. What was the reason behind its disruptive cries? Why was it preventing him from reciting the Quran? Determined to find a solution, the king devised a plan, deciding to wait for the time of Tahajjud to put it into action. As time passed, the minister stayed close, attempting to help the king in any way possible. But the king shared his struggle with no one, fearing that people might misunderstand or judge him. He didn't realize how much his people loved him. Even if someone were to sacrifice their life while accusing the king of being wrong, his subjects would never believe it. The hearts of the people were with their king, and they would never question their love for him. Time passed, and the shadows of evening began to stretch longer. The king's heartbeat quickened. This was an unprecedented experience for him, and he sat lost in his thoughts. His queen sat silently beside him, her eyes fixed on his face. After a while, she gently held his hand, looked into his fingers, and said softly, "Life has its ups and downs, but losing faith in your people is a mistake. I know you're in pain, and I understand that you don't want to share your troubles, not with me, not with your guards, not with your minister, even though we are all close to your heart. We would never misunderstand you, but right now, you see us all as wrong, and that is your greatest error. Your Majesty, I know this is a difficult time for you, but giving up is foolishness. You can confide in me. I am your partner, your wife, your companion." The king sat with his head lowered, struggling to find the words to express his pain to his queen. He felt incapable of describing the depth of his anguish. Silently, he lay down on the bed and closed his eyes, signaling that he didn't wish to speak. His queen looked at him with sadness. She had hoped that he would open up to her after hearing her words, but he remained silent. Time passed, and she lay down beside him. At the exact time of Tahajjud, the king awoke. He performed the prayer, and then once again became lost in his thoughts. He had prayed to Allah to reveal the reason behind this entire ordeal. After finishing Tahajjud, he moved toward the balcony. Sitting down, he began reciting the Quran, starting with Bismillah. He had barely read 2 verses when the donkey began braying again. The king quietly stepped onto the balcony and traced the sound to the rear of the palace. Realizing he needed to investigate, he decided not to take the long route around the palace, as the donkey might leave in the meantime. Instead, he used a secret passage in his chamber, a pathway known only to him and his queen. Descending the stairs cautiously, he opened an iron door that led outside. This secret passage was designed for his protection and was unknown to anyone else. Once outside, he took a deep breath and scanned his surroundings. Suddenly, his eyes fell on the donkey, standing to his left. The king was still holding the Quran close to his chest. He began reciting Surah Yasin in a loud and majestic voice. As soon as he started, the donkey began braying again. The king instinctively approached the donkey, but it abruptly turned and started walking away. The king was surprised. Why didn't the donkey stop? He continued reciting Surah Yasin as he followed, and the donkey fell completely silent. The king's voice was so captivating that birds began to fly alongside him. The donkey led him a considerable distance until, suddenly, the king noticed it heading toward a riverbank. What was the donkey's purpose? Was it leading him to someone in need, or was there another reason? As the king approached the river, the sight before him left him stunned. It felt as though the ground beneath his feet had vanished. In the moonlight, a beautiful young woman was diving into the river, then emerging to prostrate on the ground. She would then stand and repeat the act, plunging into the water, emerging, and bowing in prostration. She was doing this continuously, and the king was struck with awe and confusion. What was this woman doing? The king cautiously approached her. Before he could address her, she had already dived into the water again. Upon emerging, she immediately prostrated once more. The king found the situation perplexing and couldn't stand idle. For a moment, he thought the woman might stop, but she did not. Finally, in a firm yet gentle voice, the king addressed her. "O daughter of Eve, what are you doing? Is this a way to bathe? Are you in some sort of trouble?" Hearing the royal authority in his voice, she froze. The sight of the king, in his royal attire and turban, standing before her, left her stunned. Her eyes widened in disbelief. The ruler of the land himself was standing there, questioning her actions. The king, mindful of her dignity, lowered his gaze. The moonlight revealed her soaked figure and her silhouette was visible. But the king kept his eyes downcast, respecting her modesty. Hesitantly, the woman stammered, "No, Your Majesty, I am not doing anything, just—" Before she could finish, the king interjected, "Do not lie to me. There is no need to be afraid. I will not harm you. In fact, I will ensure justice for you. Your condition makes it clear that you are troubled and seeking relief. You have been performing this act for 4 or 5 days now. Am I correct?" The woman stared at the king in astonishment and hesitated before asking, "But how did you know?" The king silently thanked Allah, realizing that his lord was not displeased with him, but rather wanted to make him aware of a hidden truth. Shaking his head, the king replied, "Let's leave that aside for now. Just tell me why you are doing this. What has happened to you that has brought you to this point? Plunging into freezing water on cold nights is no small matter. Surely something so grave has occurred that it has driven you to such despair." Hearing his words, the woman dropped to her knees, clutching her chest, and burst into tears. The king, baffled by her sobs, spoke gently, "Daughter of Eve, crying alone won't solve anything. Life is full of ups and downs. People say that those who cry and stay silent are cowards, but those who cry and rise to speak for their rights are called victors. Tell me what happened. I will give you justice. I will relieve you of your distress so you won't have to endure these icy waters on these cold nights anymore." The woman looked at the king with teary eyes and began to speak, her words revealing a story that filled the king with regret and sorrow. Closing his eyes briefly, the king listened, restraining himself as he realized how dire the conditions of some of his subjects were. Through her sobs, the woman recounted, "Your Majesty, my life is steeped in hardships. By plunging into this cold water, I seek to cleanse myself. I come from a poor family. One day, I insisted on going to the fair despite my parents forbidding it. They warned me repeatedly not to go alone and said they would accompany me if I wished. But I refused. Believing myself to be grown, I dismissed their concerns, became angry with them, and left for the fair alone. Sometimes, the wisdom of our elders holds truths we can't foresee. At the fair, I felt as if someone was watching me intently. I tried to brush off the feeling but couldn't shake the sense of being followed. When I glanced back, all I saw were unfamiliar faces. I dismissed it as paranoia and entered a shop to browse. Suddenly, a loud noise came from a corner of the fair. Startled, I hesitated to move forward but decided to investigate since the sound seemed like a cry for help. As I approached, a hand suddenly covered my mouth, and I was dragged away. I screamed, struggled to push the man away, but he overpowered me. He threw me into a dark room. I only caught a glimpse of him before the darkness enveloped me. He overpowered me completely and robbed me of my dignity. I begged him for mercy, pleaded with him to stop, but he showed no compassion. He became a tyrant, and I was left utterly devastated. Her voice trembled as she continued, I cried out for help, but no one came to my aid." Hearing this, the king felt a wave of deep regret wash over him. A surge of anger coursed through him. He wished he could drag the man who had done this to the woman before him and sever his head. But at that moment, he knew he could do no such thing. Lowering his head, he remained silent for a few moments, before lifting his gaze to address the woman. "My words or actions cannot erase your pain," he said with sincerity. "But I urge you not to lose hope in your Lord. Despair is akin to disbelief. By losing hope in Allah, you began this act of seeking purification through water. But this purity can also be found in prayer. I understand that a thief has robbed you of your dignity and left you broken, and you are trying to cleanse yourself through these acts. But true purification comes from seeking forgiveness from your Lord. You disobeyed your parents, and you believe this is your punishment. But I refuse to believe that Allah works this way. Your parents never wished for you to face such pain. Let go of this false notion from your heart." As the king recited Surah Yasin from the Quran, the woman listened intently, her eyes cast downward in shame. The king continued, "Recite the Quran daily, perform your prayers, and prostrate before Allah, for He alone grants true purity. What you are doing, immersing yourself in the cold waters, is not purification. It will only lead to illness, not sanctity." The woman's demeanor softened, and the king's words brought solace to her heart. She felt an inexplicable calm and fell at the king's feet, seeking forgiveness. Without asking the king for justice, she turned to leave. Yet, the king had already pieced together who the culprit was. He recalled the day when, after leaving the rooftop for his private chamber, the minister had spoken of a man seeking an audience with him. The king connected the dots. This man must have been the perpetrator. The next day, the king ordered an investigation into the man and summoned him for a meeting after court proceedings. The man appeared, a handsome young individual, around 24 or 25 years old, who looked exhausted and guilt-ridden. His eyes refused to meet the king's, and his overall state spoke of deep remorse. As soon as the man stood before him, the king asked directly, "Did you commit an act of fornication? Did you violate a woman's dignity? Is this why you have lost your sleep and peace of mind?" The man looked at the king in shock, disbelief clear in his expression. "Your Majesty, how do you know?" he stammered. He was astounded, as he had never confided in anyone. The king, however, remained composed and responded firmly, "Leave aside how I know or who informed me. Just tell me why you committed such a heinous act against an innocent and poor girl. She neither knew you nor had any enmity with you. What grudge drove you to rob her of her honor?" The man fell silent for a few moments, then sighed deeply, gathering his courage to confess. He said, "I know I committed a grave sin and deserve severe punishment. I am prepared to face it. I lost my parents in an accident during my childhood and grew up as an orphan with no guardian to guide me. My life was filled with hardship. At first, I tried to live an honest life, working odd jobs like cleaning shoes, sweeping houses, or carrying heavy loads. But even then, I was barely able to afford a meal, and people treated me with contempt. Over time, desperation led me toward theft, and I began surviving by stealing. When I heard about the village fair, I was overjoyed, thinking it would be an easy place to steal. But at the fair, I saw this beautiful girl, and my intentions turned vile. I followed her and committed the unforgivable. Yet since that day, I have found no peace. My actions haunt me, and I am overwhelmed by guilt." The man confessed his sin before the king and expressed his readiness to accept any punishment. The king, instead of sentencing him to death, gave him an alternative. He said, You must go to that woman, apologize sincerely, and ask for her forgiveness. Then, offer her marriage as atonement for your actions. If she accepts, dedicate your life to making her happy and never commit such evil again." The man was moved by the king's decision and left with a renewed sense of purpose, heading toward the woman's home. The king, too, felt at peace, thanking Allah for his guidance. He realized that Allah was not displeased with him, but was delivering a profound message. The king could have sentenced the man to death, but he understood that Allah had already punished him. When a person loses their sleep and peace, they exist in a state of torment, neither truly alive nor dead. The man now had a purpose, and the king felt satisfied that justice had been served in the best possible way.